I know that your life has just been this like amazing expression of both healing, of outrage, of forgiveness, and there's a particular topic I know we want to address today, which is the power of an apology. And so I would love to maybe start there, and we'll see where this all wants to go. But could you tell us a little bit about why apology really matters to you and why you spent time writing a book about it and focusing on it, and what is that role of apology in your journey?
Okay. Well, first of all, I'm so happy to be in this beautiful space with all of you and this wonderful man who's been doing this for 15 years. It's just unbelievable. And I want to really honor you for that. And I feel really happy to be in community lately, whenever there's a chance, because the world just feels so perilous, and there's so much grief, and so I just want to honor that and honor the people suffering right now and bring them here so we hold them in our hearts today. You know, for me, I was reading about one of these cantankerous Trumpian characters who, his name is Nick Adams or something, and he's like one of these kind of uber macho dudes who's like creating this new ethos or old ethos and bringing it back. And he had a list of all the things you have to do to be a man. And you know what was number one? Never apologize, right? Mm-hmm. And I think, you know, in my investigation over this lifetime, which has been vast in terms of why we have violence and what is violence and why it keeps perpetuating and going on, the non-apology, to me, seems like one of the central columns to patriarchy, right? It's literally holding it up. And I think from a young age, boys are taught to apologize is an expression of weakness, vulnerability, humiliation / humility, that if you say you're wrong, then the whole deck of cards is going to start falling down. And I grew up in a very violent family. My father was a tyrant, and he was a person who hadn't processed a lot of his own self-hatred and grief, but he had a lot of power in the family and in his own work. And so I was really, in many ways, an outcome of violence. I was a consequence of violence. I was beaten regularly. I was sexually abused. So much of my childhood, I was formed in that cauldron of violence. And after I left home, I think I dreamed perpetually that there would come a day when my father would say, "I'm sorry." He would wake up and he would come to his senses and he would realize what he had done. And, you know, that happens to people sometimes in older age, that they have a revelation about their life. And that never happened. And he died without ever saying, "I'm sorry." As a matter of fact, he didn't even let me know he was dying. And then the whole Me Too movement happened. And, you know, I've been in this movement to end violence against women and girls now for 26 years. And I think I've waited all these years for this moment that a man who's been violent, who's abused, who's been called out, who's gone to, is going to come forward and publicly apologize in a way that relieves people of their angst, anxiety, self-hatred, disbelief, all of those things, and it's just never happened. So I did a lot of research, and I just couldn't find one public apology of a man in history, And I thought, this is...
I'm sorry for that. I apologize. I really do apologize. We suck. I apologize.
But
Go ahead.
Thank you. I appreciate it. But this seems significant. This seemed like a significant omission. So I decided that I was going to write my father's apology to me for what he had done. And this was a profound, excavating, devastating, but ultimately liberatory, the most liberatory experience of my life. And when I highly recommend it with support. But I will say one of the things that I discovered in this process is, look, when you are a victim of somebody, right, we don't have that many places in our culture that allows us to process that where we can have a new identity other than a victim or a survivor. And so my whole life was really predicated on that story, those events that occurred between, that trauma that occurred between my father and I. I was a reaction to that. He was always determining the narrative because I was always resisting him in one way or another. When I was protesting, when I was organizing, when I was writing, it was still his story, right? It was still his story. What writing this apology did is I exited his narrative. I left his narrative. I left the world of my father. I left the world of his abuse. I'm no longer his victim. I'm not living a life as anybody's victim. I am my own person. And part of what had to happen in the writing of that book, you know, once I made a determination to write it, I basically called my father in as an ancestor, and he came. And I feel like we wrote the book together.
Wow.
And he was there all around me. He would wake me up at 4 o'clock in the morning and say, go to your office, I have something to tell you. And he'd tell me a story, and I'd be like, wow, that's an amazing story. And I'd write it down. But I feel through the process of the book, I reached a point where I had to feel who my father was, what made him who he was, why he was the person he was. I began to understand it, not justify it, but understand it. And when I began to understand it, it had nothing to do with me. My father was that, and I was the thing that was I was standing there. I was that thing. It wasn't me. Yeah. And that was a huge revelation, and I think when I reached the point of where I was in my pain, my father's pain, our pain, the pain of the world, it was the most excruciating moment, but then it was like a door opened, and it was like, whew, I went through. Oh. And I think what I learned is that apology is probably the most important thing we can be doing in the world at this time if we're really true about apology and the depth of it and the size of it and what it means. It's as profound as prayer or meditation. It is a pathway to another world.
Wow. Wow.